see this mythology that trans people who by and large are among the most economically battered groups in the United States, more subject to homelessness, more subject to unemployment. Nonetheless, we're told by Andrew Sullivan and the TERFs and the right wing that trans people are elites, that they're trying to impose their elitist gender ideology on the rest of us. That's exactly the same kind of mythology that we heard in Zimbabwe, in Egypt, in countless other countries. My point here is that if we want to fight these homophobic and transphobic moral panics, we need, first of all, to stop congratulating ourselves that they don't happen here in the United States, because they do happen in the United States. We need to stop thinking that it's just a question of homophobia or transphobia. Because most of the people who are promoting these panics, they don't have the first idea what homosexuality or God forbid what they call transgenderism is. They don't know enough to be genuinely phobic. What they're doing is they're either exploiting the situation, exploiting people to explain, or they're desperately trying to explain to themselves a more fundamental fact, which is inequality, which is the destruction of economies by austerity, by structural adjustment, by global neoliberalism. And in fact, if you look at country after country where these moral panics have happened, they've come in the trail of structural adjustment programs, of austerity programs, of neoliberal economics. So I think we have to go back and look at the economic and political roots of homophobia and transphobia and other human rights violations. We have to think of this in terms of the root causes. And if we think of it in terms of the root causes, then we will open up a space for political identification and political coalition with other groups who have been affected by the same policies, with other communities that have been devastated by the same programs, with other victims of structural adjustment and neoliberalism and austerity and all the words that have been wrecking human lives. I think we start with identity politics because we start within our own communities and we start with understanding what hatred is doing to our own communities. But when we go down to the root, when we look at the root causes, we discover that other identities are suffering, other identities are being singled out. And out of that, I think we can build a broader politics that actually tackles inequality domestically and globally and starts to roll back the root causes.
Amazing, thank you. And going off script again, can you just explain a bit about structural adjustment?
Yeah. In the late 1980s, in the 1980s, going into the 1990s, really starting earlier in the 1970s, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the US government all started promoting basically Reaganite and Thatcherite economics in the developing world, in the third world. But they did it with a gun to the heads of governments, because most of these governments were deeply in debt. And basically the US, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund said, all right, well, you owe us, and we're going to screw you over these debts unless you privatize every state-owned industry, privatize everything, privatize education, privatize water, privatize land, cut public services at every possible opportunity, cut health, cut education, cut public transport, basically destroy the services that people have been relying on, and the poor in particular have been relying on as tools to develop, as tools to economic, as pathways to economic uplift. And these programs were enforced for 20, 25 years. They were so destructive in terms of health setbacks, disease, and massive economic inequality that the World Bank and the IMF started backing away from them. But in one form or another, they're still being carried out. And what we saw after 2008, after the financial crisis, was that most governments in the developed world, in Europe in particular, felt that, well, the answer to the crisis for us is to impose structural adjustment at home, to privatize, to cut back on services, to cut back on health, education. And what we've seen again is massive, massive inequality in all these countries.
Yeah, I remember reading in 2008 they cut a lot of the public health departments in a lot of places in the US. So then what happens when COVID comes around? They're like, oh no, we can't test, we can't trace, we can't do much. And we can see how that's.
Well, you're seeing it right now. You're seeing it in the difficulty that public health institutions and hospitals have had in coping with COVID here in the United States. And then look at India, which has had one form or another of structural adjustment or austerity for 2.5 decades. And right now there's a sort of public health massacre going on with tens of thousands of people dying. And it's partly because these programs destroyed the hospital systems. That's what has been imposed on the developing world and on large parts of the developed world for the last quarter century to 40 years. And of course, people are angry about it. Of course, people know that their lives have been destroyed. Of course, they're looking for an explanation for inequality. And it's easy for governments to come in and basically promote a witch hunt as an explanation. And that's what we're seeing around the world. But we're not going to solve this just by going in and saying, there really are no witches. We're only going to solve this when we address the inequality itself. And LGBT people need to be a voice in calling out inequality and calling out for better solutions.
Thank you, yes. Thank you so much. Let's see, and this comes right on the heels of what you were saying, actually fits perfectly. You've written a lot of really good stuff about big corporations, how they try to launder their reputations, but not by cleaning up their actions generally, just by looking better, maybe doing a few things that are actually good, but staying the way they are fundamentally, and why we really shouldn't go along with that. So I'd love a few examples of this and then some thoughts on how our economic systems would need to change to actually uphold human rights.
Yeah, well, I just found on Twitter the other day a tweet from Outright Action International, which is an organization for which I was program director for a long time, about 20 years ago. And their Outright is part of something called the Partnership for Global LGBTI Equality, which sounds wonderful, doesn't it? It's a consortium of corporations that was actually launched at Davos at the World Economic Forum 2 years ago, also with the assistance of another organization I used to work for, Human Rights Watch. It's a bunch of corporations.
You got frozen again. I'm sorry, probably my internet. Okay, frozen.
Hello?
Now you just came through. Frozen for maybe 30 seconds. Yes. My apologies.
Okay, that's okay. So this is a consortium of corporations that gets together to talk about LGBTI equality. And they're having another talk for Pride Week or Pride Month about resilience and advancing LGBTIQ rights. I was fascinated by this because the invitation doesn't really mean anything. And I'm always suspicious when I read language that doesn't mean anything. So it says, this discussion will discover challenges and resilient strategies of multi-sectoral actors working in challenging geographies. And I'm like, okay, what the hell is a resilient strategy? And what is a multi-sectoral actor? And what is a challenging geography? When you talk like that, you're trying to cover something up, I usually think. The corporations that are part of this wonderful enterprise include, well, they include Procter and Gamble, P&G, which um, most recently, I think if you ask anybody in Malaysia, Procter and Gamble is known there for turning a blind eye to horrific abuses in the extraction of palm oil for its food production. It includes PricewaterhouseCoopers, the accounting firm, which, if you ask anybody in Angola, is uh, famous primarily for having very consciously and deliberately helped the former First Lady of Angola embezzle millions of dollars from the state by just, doing what accountants are good at, cooking the books. So I don't think any of the corporations who are part of this enterprise have particularly sterling human rights records, but LGBT rights is something they can all agree on. They all have LGBT employees working for them. This will help keep them happy, maybe keep them from joining a union. And it makes them look good. It makes them look like they're doing something for human rights. Now, I find it disgraceful that two nonprofits that I used to work for and whose work in the past I've thought very highly of, even when I wasn't working for them, I find it kind of disgraceful that they're part of this little enterprise, which is basically intended to make the corporations look good. It makes sense that they're part of it, though, because what they want is to get some money from these corporations, and they probably will get some money out of it. I don't know if you're just to give another example. I don't know if you're aware that Grindr, anybody who's gay who's out there listening, of course, knows Grindr. It's that wonderful little app that helps all us queers have sex. But they've repeatedly had major gaps in their security system, which have allowed basically anybody who's technically aware enough to pinpoint exactly where someone is accessing the web from. And in a country like Egypt, where you have a technically sophisticated government that wants to arrest queers, this kind of security gap can be deadly. And yet, Outright International has held a whole panel with Grindr a couple of years ago to talk about Grindr's work for human rights in the developing world, and not once did they ask Grindr, by the way, that security breach, did you ever fix it? No, why not? It didn't come up. And again, I think the reason is that Grindr gives away a lot of money, and everybody wants a bit of the pot. Again, I'm going to say the same thing I said about governments. They are not our friends. Corporations are not our friends. They are not in the business of friendship. They exist to make profits, and what they do is fundamentally what's best for the bottom line. We can exert pressure on corporations by shaming them, basically, the same way that we do with offending governments, by saying, you have done wrong here and you need to do better and do something about it. And instead, I think a lot of human rights organizations are abandoning the naming and shaming practices which they use with governments, and instead adopting this weird kind of flattery strategy with corporations, which just doesn't work. You're not going to get anything in return. The other thing I want to say, though, is that I think a lot of us on the left in general in the United States have become very reliant on using corporate pressure to obtain progressive goals. So when Georgia or Texas passes a repressive, anti-democratic, anti-voting law, the first thing we think of is, well, how can we get, Pepsi or Coke or corporations to step in and, boycott Georgia, boycott Texas, whatever? How can we use money as a form of pressure? And I'm not saying that shouldn't be done. I'm not saying that shouldn't be done where it will work. But what it does is to reinforce and reaffirm one of the fundamental problems with the United States now, which is that money rules.